Hello, this is Professor Broker, and this is your Chapters 7 and 8 lecture, Welfare Economics, Part 2. Let's get started. So remember, we were talking about the allocation of resources and is that desirable? We were developing the tool called Welfare Economics to help us analyze gains to consumers and also gains to producers, which is what this lecture is going to be about. And then we're going to combine those two and see gains in the overall market. And then we're going to ask the question, is the market allocation of resources desirable using this analysis, using welfare economics analysis? Okay, and remember, when we say welfare economics, we are not, we are not talking about transfer programs like welfare to needy families or SNAP and food assistance and food stamps and things like that. We are not talking about those things in this analysis. Those are actually separate issues. Okay. So we've developed the demand curve and gains to buyers. Now we need to discuss gains to sellers. To do that, we need to look at cost and the supply curve. Okay, obviously cost is the value of everything a seller must give up to produce a good, including their opportunity costs. Okay, and obviously a seller would like to sell their product for a price above their cost, right? And what we're going to say is that for a seller would be willing to sell their product or offer their services for any price equal to or above the cost to produce it, but would not be willing to supply the good or service if the price in the market is below their costs of supplying the good or service, right? So here we have three sellers in a lawn cutting business. We have Jack, who has a cost of mowing a lawn, say, of $10 per lawn. Janet, a cost of $20 per lawn. And Chrissy, say, has a cost of $35 per lawn. And you might think, well, what could drive the differences in those costs, right? Well, we're probably assuming that they all do roughly the same job and they all do equally well at that job cutting the lawn, and they all have roughly the same equipment. Now it is possible they might have slightly different equipment. Jack might be slightly more efficient, Chrissy might be slightly less efficient. Something else driving these differences in costs might be their opportunity cost, right? Maybe Jack's just getting started and he doesn't, he's willing to take just about any business just to get his name out there, right? And so he's willing to to take a price as low as $10 a lawn, whereas Chrissy maybe is well established. Maybe she has a long list of potential customers to choose from, and there's only so much time in the day, and so she can be a little bit more choosy. She could even charge maybe a slightly higher price, right? Because her opportunity cost would be larger in that respect, right? And so there might be multiple things driving those differences in costs. But again, a seller will be willing to produce and sell the good only if the price is equal to, in our case, or exceeds his or her cost. Okay, therefore cost really is our measure of willingness to sell, just like willingness to pay was sort of our measure to how we derived our demand curve for consumers. Our cost is really our measure of the willingness to sell in our model for producers. Okay, so now let's see if we can derive a supply schedule from this cost data, right? So assuming what we've assumed, that a seller will sell it if the price is above their cost and not sell it if the price is below the cost, for a price between $0 and $9 per lawn in the market, will any of these three producers provide the product? Well, of course not, right? Because those prices would be below all of these costs. But if the price is between $10 and $19, who would we gain? Right? Well, all of a sudden Jack would be willing to supply the product in that case, right? Jack would be willing to mow that lawn, right? Maybe because his opportunity costs are lower, but his cost is only $10. Okay? If the price rises to $20 to $34 range, we would still have Jack. Jack would obviously still be willing to mow the lawn for a higher price, but all of a sudden we would gain Janet, right? And so now our quantity supplied would be 2, and as the price continues to rise, then above $35, we would gain Chrissy. We would have all three sellers, right? Notice the upward sloping nature, the direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. As the price ranges go up, the quantity supplied in our market went up, right? And we see that that's directly connected to our cost structures. Okay, now let's go ahead and graph this. And so again, at low prices, did we have any sellers? No, of course not. That's the reason for the vertical nature there between $0 and $10. But then at $10, we gain our first seller, right? Jack. And then it's not until the price rises again to $20 to $34 that we gain our second seller, right? So again, that's 0 to 9, we didn't have anybody, but at 10 to 19, we gain Jack, right? At 20 to 34, we gain our second marginal seller, okay? And then finally, at above $35, we gain our third marginal seller. Notice again the stair-step nature, okay, of the supply curve. Again, remember, it's just like demand. Don't let this freak you out. It's kind of like we zoomed in on our smooth linear supply curve, and we're seeing the little itty bitty stair steps. In an actual competitive market, we would zoom out. There would be dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of sellers, and these little tiny stair steps would really be indiscernible, and it would be a smooth curve like we've seen in other chapters. Okay, notice that each as the price rises, we gain marginal sellers, and if the price falls, notice that we would lose specific marginal sellers. Each point along this supply curve directly corresponds to an actual seller with an actual cost structure. So at a price of 10, right, really 10 to 19, we have Jack. He is the marginal seller at that point. Then above $20, right, between 20 and 34, we gain Janet. She really is the marginal seller there that we either gain if the price is rising or lose if the price is falling. And then as the price rises above 35, we gain Chrissy as the marginal seller, right? She will jump into the market if the price rises above that amount, and if the price falls below 35, we lose her as the marginal seller. Okay, now, so we've derived the supply curve from cost. Okay, but then how do we measure value in the market to producers? Well, we're going to take the gain that they get from selling their product or service, which would be the price. That's what they gain from being in the market, minus how much it costs them to produce it, right? And so if I'm a seller and I'm selling ice cream cones and I get $3 per ice cream cone and it only cost me $1 to produce every ice cream cone, I have gained, right, $2, the 3 minus the 1, or $2. That would be my producer surplus. Okay, and that's what we're going to look at here. So suppose the price is $25, right? Okay, well, applying both the formula and the graph, we would, again, we would draw a horizontal line, just like we did for consumer surplus. We would draw a horizontal line over to the supply curve. Now, in this case, we're going to do price minus the cost. So it would be everything graphically below that price figure, but above what graphically represents our cost, which is our supply curve, right? So everything below price, but above supply, right? Now notice we would have a quantity supply of 2. We would have Jack, right, who would have a producer surplus individually of $15, 25 minus 10. Okay, and then you would have the producer surplus of Janet individually of 25 minus 20, or $5. So you would have a total producer surplus, because Chrissy would not sell the product, so she would have a producer surplus of 0, but you would have a total producer surplus of the 15 plus the 5, or $20. Everything below below the price and above the supply curve there. Okay? Now, what if we made our supply curve smooth? Okay, well, let's look at it that way. Okay, imagine the price is $40. What would be the marginal seller's cost, right, or producer surplus, let's say, of the 15,000th seller, or the 15th seller in this case? Okay, well, again, the 15th seller would be representative of a point on a specific point on the supply curve, and whatever dollar value is associated with that point, that would be their cost. So in this case, it's 30. Now, if the price is 40, then that marginal seller, the 15th marginal seller, would have a producer surplus of how much? The 40 minus the 30, or $10, right? So that would be the producer surplus for just that marginal seller if the price was 40. Okay, but what would be the producer surplus if the price was 40 for this entire market? Well, again, what shape does it make with the smooth supply curve? Okay, and we are using the y-axis here, then notice that this is a triangle, and so again it would be base times height divided by 2. Okay, and so again, if we want to use this as our height, it would be 40, the price minus the y-intercept of the supply curve, and so 40 minus 15 in that case, or 25, times 25, right, which would be the distance, the quantity distance from the origin all the way over to that 25 quantity, okay, times 1/2 or divided by 2, or $312.50. That's how much value, right, is created, or 312,500 if we're going to use the thousands. But that's how much dollar value is actually generated for producers for when the price in this market is $40 given this supply structure and cost structure. Okay, that's how much producers benefit from participating in this market at this price. Okay. Now, but the price doesn't remain stagnant, right? Prices can change. So say, for example, there's a decrease in demand. Maybe demand decreases, lowering the price to $30. What would happen to producer surplus? Well, producer surplus would go down, right? Because all of a sudden you'd have 30 minus 15, or 15 times the new quantity supplied of 15, okay, divided by 2, which would be 112.50. Okay, so producer surplus would go down, and it would go down for two reasons. It would go down, first of all, because some sellers, okay, their cost structure is greater than 30. So they would not be willing to supply the product at a price of 30, okay, because their costs are greater than that. So they would leave the market, okay? They would leave the market when we lose that producer surplus. But also, even for the producers who remain in the market, they are now getting a lower price, and so that cuts into their producer surplus. So they, even though they're still in the market, they're still supplying it, they obviously are worse off because of the lower price. So now that we have producer surplus, we can combine that concept with consumer surplus to look at total surplus, the total gains in the market. So remember, consumer surplus is the value to buyers, or the willingness to pay, minus the price actually paid by buyers, right? This measures the buyer's gain from participating in the market. Producer surplus is the amount received by sellers, or the price, minus the cost to sellers. This measures the seller's gain from participating in the market. Okay, and total surplus is simply going to be consumer surplus plus producer surplus. Now, if and this measures total gains from trade in the market, from buyers and sellers trading and exchanging with each other in a marketplace. Total surplus measures the total gains from those transactions. And notice that if consumer surplus, the value to buyers, the willingness to pay minus the price, plus the price minus the cost to sellers, what can we eliminate there, right? If that's what total surplus equals, we can eliminate the price term, right? And so total surplus really is simply the value to buyers measured by the demand curve minus the cost to sellers measured by the supply curve. So everything between the demand curve and the supply curve is our total surplus in the market. Okay, and so graphically, let's say here's our market. We have our supply curve. We have our demand curve. Equilibrium is obviously $30, and 15,000 shoes is the equilibrium quantity. So now, what would be consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus for this, market, for trade taking place in this market given these market conditions? Well, consumer surplus would obviously be representative of the area above the $30 price, but below the demand curve, right? Producer surplus would be the area below the $30 price, but above the supply curve, right? Because price minus cost, whereas consumer surplus was the value to buyers, the willingness to pay, minus the price. Okay, total surplus is that entire triangle, everything below demand, but above the supply curve. Okay, both consumer plus the producer surplus. Okay, and in this case, if we wanted to find total surplus, we could either find consumer surplus, right, which would be the 30 times 15 divided by 2, which would be 225, or we could do the producer surplus, which would, and we could add that to producer surplus, which would be 30 minus 15 times 15 divided by 2, which would be 112.5. Okay, we could add those two together, or we could do the 60 minus the 15, which would be 45, times the quantity 15 divided by 2, which would just give us obviously 337.5. This is obviously excluding the thousands, but $337.50, right, or $337,000, and $500, which would represent the total dollar value that market participants benefit from participating in this market. Okay, so you can do it either way. You can just calculate that big triangle, just by itself, or you can calculate consumer surplus and then add it to producer surplus. Now, identifying and calculating consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus is one thing. But now we want to ask the question, is the market equilibrium efficient? Okay, that's what we want to look at next. Is the market's allocation of resources desirable? Is that a desirable price? Is that a desirable quantity that we get with equilibrium? Or would a different allocation of resources make society better off? Okay, now, to answer efficiency, we're going to be using total surplus, right? And basically, the bigger the total surplus is, the more market participants benefit. Therefore, we can assume the more efficient the allocation of resources is. Now, just because something's efficient doesn't necessarily mean that it's equal or that it's equitable. And so we're really, again, we're zeroing in on the concept of efficiency here. Is the market allocation efficient? Which would be representative of a maximum total surplus. Okay, and that might be true, and yet it still might be unequal. And so I don't want you to confuse the two terms. Efficiency deals with the size of the economic pie, which is important to a lot of people, to probably most people, because it measures standard of living generally. But equality is how the pie is sliced up and how big the individual slices are and how they compare to one another, and that also tends to be important to people. We won't necessarily get at equality in this particular chapter yet. Okay, but let's look at efficiency. So again, total surplus is value to buyers minus cost to sellers. Okay, an allocation of resources is efficient if it maximizes total surplus. Our economic pie is the largest, right, if total surplus is maximized, and if the goods are consumed by the buyers who value them the most highly. If the consumers who value the goods the most highly are the ones that actually are the ones consuming it, then you're maximizing consumer surplus. If the goods are produced by the producers with the lowest costs, then you're maximizing producer surplus. And if by raising or lowering the quantity in the market you don't increase total surplus, then you can be sure that a competitive market equilibrium actually does maximize our economic pie and maximize our total surplus, and thus maximize efficiency in the market. So let's look at these questions in turn. Which consumers consume our goods? So let's go back to this shoe market, and here we have our demand curve, and the market price is 30, and there's 15,000 shoes demanded at that price. Well, who buys the shoes? Well, remember, the demand curve represents marginal buyers, right? And every buyer in this market whose willingness to pay is greater than or equal to 30 buys the shoes, right? It's representative of that upper left portion of the demand curve. Buyers who value the good less than $30, they don't buy the shoes. That's what our model predicts, right? And so absolutely, I mean, our model is showing that buyers who value the good most highly are the ones who are consuming it, right? Now, what about the cost and the sellers, right? Well, every seller whose cost is less than or equal to 30 would be willing to produce the good, right? And if their cost is greater than 30, they would not provide or produce the shoes, all right? Because their cost would be greater than the price. And so absolutely, the sellers with the lowest cost are the ones producing the good in our marketplace, okay? In our competitive market. Now, does changing the equilibrium quantity though maximize, can that increase total surplus? Well, let's think about it. If we increase the quantity, say, to 20, the marginal seller at that point has a cost of $35, right? And what would be the marginal buyer's value of the 20th marginal buyer's value would only be $20. So if we produced 20 units here, okay, notice that that 20th unit would have a cost of $35, but only be valued by that marginal buyer at $20. In other words, if we actually produced and then sold that shoe, we would actually be reducing total surplus by $15 because the cost would be $15 greater than the value. Okay, that would be, this entire triangle here would actually, to the right of equilibrium, would actually represent a reduction of total surplus. Okay, and we could actually increase total surplus by decreasing quantity back to equilibrium. But what happens if we are at a lower quantity? Well, at a lower quantity, say the 10th unit, we would have a cost of 15, and the marginal seller would have a cost of, of $25. The marginal seller would have a cost of $25. The marginal buyer at that quantity would have a value of the product of $40. So clearly that unit is actually beneficial, right? That would be adding to total surplus because the value 40 is greater than the cost 25. But the thing is so would the 11th unit. So would the 12th unit. Each of these units between 10 and 15 units would have a value to the buyers greater than the cost to the sellers. Therefore, each of those units would increase total surplus. Therefore, if we're at 10 units, we could increase total surplus by increasing quantity to the equilibrium. In other words, equilibrium really does maximize our total surplus, and we cannot increase the total surplus by moving by deviating from equilibrium. Okay, so basically what we've illustrated is that a competitive free market with good information really does maximize efficiency in the market and economic well-being in the marketplace for market participants. And this was described by Adam Smith in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, written in 1776, where he said, "Man has almost constant occasion for the help of his brethren, and it is vain for him to expect it from their benevolence only. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest." In other words, you go get lunch somewhere, right? You expect them to have food for you, not because they necessarily have this deep love and affection for you, but because they want to make a profit, right? Well, in the same way, you're not going there to make a donation, to some philanthropy. You're going there giving them money in exchange for a good or service that they're providing, right? And you want it to be done well. And so you're acting in your self-interest, they're acting in their self-interest, consumers and producers, and basically this interaction, what we've shown, really does maximize efficiency in the market and value in the market. So every individual neither intends to be promoting the public interest nor knows how much he's promoting it when he's acting in these, singularly self-interested ways, both profit maximizing for the producer and utility maximizing for the consumer. Each producer and consumer only intends his own gain, and yet he is in this, as in many other ways, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his motivation. Nor was it worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interests, both producers and consumers, he frequently promotes that of society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. What he's really saying there is that when producers try to maximize their profits in a self-interested way and consumers try to maximize their utility or their benefit in a self-interested way, that leads to a competitive market equilibrium, and that actually creates more value for society often than when, for example, we try to intervene in the market through policies, through government policies and such, that are trying to help people, but oftentimes can have unintended consequences, is basically what he's saying there. So basically, in conclusion, what we've shown with welfare economics is that if markets can be competitive, and sometimes they're not, but if they are, and there's no market failures, externalities, or market power, then the market allocation really does maximize total surplus, well-being, and efficiency.